friends, and thank you for joining us on Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the Democratic coalition. This podcast is produced by Way to Win. I'm your host, Kerry Eleveld, and today I am joined by
Tory Gavito, co-founder and president of Way to Win.
And Joe Hamill, the strategic advisor at Way to Win.
Strategery. That's what Joe specializes in. We also have a very special guest today, Caitlin Jury, a research director at the polling firm Equis, which just released a super interesting poll of Latinos that raises some questions about whether Republicans will be able to parlay the gains Trump made with Latino voters in 2024 into future elections. Caitlin has been a leader in the progressive digital and market research space, and she specializes in creative testing, message strategy, and digital advertising. And before joining the Equis team, she served as a digital media planner at Break Something and Priorities USA. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
All right. Here we go. Let's jump into it. Caitlin, I know you worked hard on crafting this poll. What were some of your top line takeaways from the results?
Yeah, so this research was really intended to be a deep dive specifically on the economy. We really wanted to understand Latino attitudes and preferences towards like economic and cost of living issues, and to really get a sense of how they were feeling about the Trump administration and Republicans' approach to taking on those things. And big picture, it's clear that Latinos are frustrated with Trump's approach to handling their current economic anxieties. We're seeing Trump economic approval be net negative and has decreased actually from earlier polling we did this year in May. His approval among Latino voters overall, like as his job as president, is also net negative and dropping. And so there's clearly some signs of increased frustration around Trump's ability to deliver on some of his campaign promises among the Hispanic electorate. We're also seeing frustration with Republicans broadly. We asked about issue trust, like who do you trust more to handle the economy or cost of living? And actually this cycle, we've seen twice now this year in our research that Democrats have an advantage on handling the cost of living, on trust, on handling the cost of living in the economy among Latino voters, whereas last cycle, we were seeing Republicans have an advantage there. So there's certainly signs of increased frustration and distrust. A fun question we asked this time, we talked a lot over the past several years, probably back since 2016, about Trump's image as a good businessman. And so we asked in this poll whether or not Latino voters believe that Trump is a good businessman, whether they used to think he was and don't anymore, or if they don't outright. A plurality of Latinos actually don't think Trump is a good businessman, but the most important or interesting data point we found is that 1 in 5 Latinos are telling us that they used to think he was a good businessman, but they don't anymore. So certainly signs of distrust. And then the last thing I'll say just for the distrust point is as we look at 2026, as we start to think about where folks will fall when the midterms come around next year in November, we're actually seeing a third of voters who just voted for Trump tell us that they're not set on voting for Republicans next year. So Republicans certainly shouldn't assume that they'll hold on to all of the gains they may have seen with Trump specifically in 2024 when it comes to the Hispanic electorate.
Super interesting. I think one of the questions right off the bat, and I have more questions that I want to dive into, but is this question of, does this poll, and it seems like it does, but does this give us a sense of whether you really think, Trump is going to be able to parlay the gains he made with Latino voters, that Republicans are going to be able to, parlay that into 2024, or if you're seeing cracks emerging? And it seems like maybe you're seeing cracks emerging.
Definitely. I think there are certainly signs of cracks in Trump's coalition here. This is also a poll is a snapshot of a moment in time. I don't think we're pretending to predict the future. Who knows what will happen? And next November is still pretty far away. But as far as what we're seeing in this polling, the fact that a third of voters who just voted for Trump in November, including repeat Trump voters, like of all the Latinos that just voted for Trump in November, a third of them aren't set on voting for a Republican next November. And there's this key swing group of Latinos that we often talk about at Equis, who we call Biden defectors. And these are folks that voted for Biden in 2020 and then switched to vote for Trump in 2024. Only a third of those folks, so all of them just voted for Trump in November, but only a third of them are telling us they think they'll vote for a Republican next year. So the swingiest section of the electorate isn't even majority intending to vote for a Republican in the midterms.
It's fascinating. I mean, I do wonder, like, you know, we always look at, I mean, one of the progressive fascinations with Trump is that it doesn't matter what he does. He never manages to like alienate his MAGA base, right? He just they just doesn't matter. He can insult, you know, he can do poorly on the economy. He can insult, military officers. He can, whatever he does, it just seems like it doesn't stick to him with his MAGA base. But you're saying that even with, I'm just wondering if Latino voters as a bloc are demonstrating something just a little different. You're saying that even some of his repeat voters are suggesting that they're not all that into, they're not necessarily going to vote for Republicans. Or the other side of that is potentially that, I'm just thinking about that. The other side of this is just that whatever he has in terms of, a hold on the Latino voters who voted for him is that it just doesn't translate to Republicans. So there's kind of like, I mean, it could be a combination of the two. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there for something to chew on.
Yeah, there's lots of factors at play, certainly. I don't have the number in front of me of among repeat Trump voters in particular, what percent aren't set on voting for a Republican. But it feels notable that among a group of people who, like all the Latino voters that just voted for Trump in November, you'd expect to see more certainty for voting for a Republican going into the midterms. Like for Harris voters, much more Harris voters are telling us that they intend to vote for a Democrat in the midterms compared to Trump voters who are telling us that they intend to vote for a Republican. So there is a question of like how much of this was Trump, how much can Republicans really hold on to whatever gains were made if the gains were in some way, at least in part, Trump specific.
Interesting.
Well, it does seem like at a time when Democrats sorely need some good news. I know that I know many of us are kind of working in our different trenches to rebuild the party brand, rebuild the party, help candidates and champions, weighing on this redistricting fight. And that was just my week last week. But in any case, it feels like this segment, I'm hearing you say the Biden defectors. So those are voters that voted for Biden in 20 and then switched to Trump in 24. And then that at least a third, you're saying a third of the defectors are saying, I don't know. And then pairing that with what we know from what we call the skippers. So defectors is another word for like flippers, right? So then our research, that's like they voted for Biden in 20 and they just didn't come back out in 24 because Trump might have been a bridge too far, but they weren't compelled by the Democrat. Right. And we've been down that road. We've explained that a little bit. So, but that combo gives us some hope, right? Like that's just like, that feels like a coalition, it feels like a both and that could really put the Republicans back on their heels in 26, especially when you think about it from the Latino bloc and how much I'm still have Texas redistricting on my mind, but it's just like how much they're banking on the couch or kind of the Trump phenomenon to be a reason for redrawing these seats and taking some big bets, particularly in South Texas. And it does feel like it should give us some hope by pairing these two data sets together.
I do feel hopeful coming out of this work. It feels like there's just some really obvious signs and continued signs, worsening signs over time this year of discontent and disapproval with Trump and Republicans among the Hispanic electorate. What I will say is I feel like there's a real opportunity. I think you would agree with me, Tory. Like there's a real opportunity here, but I do think Democrats have to do something about it. One of the other big takeaways from this research is that we're just seeing increased cynicism towards both parties. So while people are less likely to say that they trust Republicans on these issues, a lot of them are moving into the trust neither party camp. They tell us they don't trust Democrats or Republicans on these things. And even in the generic ballot question, so when we ask folks about their midterm vote choice for next year, a lot of folks are moving away from Republicans, but into this like undecided bucket. So I do think there's an opportunity for Democrats to capitalize on the moment that we're in, but they certainly need to be offering or communicating more loudly about what their vision is for the future on some of the issues that are most important to Latinos, like the economy or immigration, for example.
For sure.
Yeah, let's get into so this is something, first of all, just to double down on what you're saying, like we are constantly in the camp of there is hope, there is reason for optimism, but not if Democrats do nothing. Like it's just like both things are true, right? So I think we're sort of aligned in that sense. Let's hear just a little bit more about these Biden defectors, because I know that one of the things that Joe's interested in is he did see some parallels between the Biden defectors and in our skipper polling, our Biden skipper polling. So if we could get a little bit more into that, like if you could tell us a little bit more about what you learned about these folks, and then maybe Joe can weigh in and give us a sense of where he's seeing some overlap.
Cool.
Yeah, I can start. So like I said, just to repeat the definition. So these folks are people who voted for Biden in 2020. So they're people who are willing to vote for a Democrat. And then in 2024, they switched their vote choice and they decided to vote for Trump. There are a lot of different factors in why any individual person makes a decision about who to vote for. But it seems obvious that at least in part, these folks were expressing some frustration around their cost of living concerns or their financial challenges. You know, we also asked about personal financial situations in this research, and just like really heartbreaking data about where Latinos are financially in this country right now. A third of them told us they can't even make ends meet. They're not even able to meet their expenses. An additional third say they can just meet expenses and that's it. So 2/3 of Latinos are telling us they're scraping by. And I think that you can feel that economic insecurity and fear and frustration in some of the electoral shifts that we've been seeing for some time. So Biden defectors in part took a chance on Trump because of their anxieties around the economy. And they really just wanted to see some action be taken around lowering the cost of living. There are other factors and other important issues, but given the economics conversation, the economy was certainly a big part of their voting calculus. And so it makes sense then that we're seeing Biden defectors be frustrated around Trump's inability to deliver on those cost of living concerns. Things are not less expensive. Wages haven't gone up. A lot of their concerns haven't been addressed yet by the Trump administration. And so sometimes when we talk to Biden defectors, we feel them in this wait and see mode. That's how we talk about it. Like they're frustrated that nothing has happened yet, but they're still, since it's so early in the administration, they're willing to wait and give him the benefit of the doubt in some cases. But yeah, these are folks who had voted for a Democrat in the past and decided to take a chance on Trump. Like I said, at least in part because of their concerns around the economy and their frustration maybe that Democrats hadn't been able to deliver solutions to some of those pain points.
Yeah, I think that squares up with what we were saying again with like our broad skippers. And we're always looking, right, for like this, what are the narratives and what are the stories and the messages that can unite a larger coalition? And so when we find these things, it's like we don't have to have a story for Latino flippers and a story for like we can tell one big loud story, as you said. I think the economic piece is such an important factor when we were talking to the folks that skipped, right? The one of the main reason folks cited why they didn't vote this time was because of Harris's lack of like an economic story that they thought was going to impact them. And so it is to your point, like all of the various decisions that go into people's, making a decision to vote or to not, or to switch votes. It's like the same sort of thing that's going to get someone to choose the couch, could get someone to give Trump a try this time. And it really did feel like across the board, this economic, this economic story was what was driving people to switch or to stay home. And then we also asked, you're talking about like people moving into the undecided column. And we asked some of the skippers, like what they regret most. Right now, they're citing regret most about not voting is the fact that cost of living is not changing. They aren't seeing that impact, and some of the massive cuts, especially in the last bill, which I feel like also square up with what we're seeing from the Latino voters that y'all talk to. So I feel like there's lots of sort of clear signals on where we need to be going, what stories we need to be telling voters on what's happening right now.
Yeah, one thing that jumped out at me in terms of things that just felt like an echo of things that we've heard in our skipper focus groups and also seen in the polling is that the policies Latinos favor include taxing billionaires and wealthy corporations over cutting social services. And I do roughly here. This may hurt your soul, Caitlin. Roughly is something that I used on a podcast because it's really hard for people to be like 73.5%, but like roughly 80% support increasing taxes on billionaires and big corporations, and roughly 80% oppose cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. In your polling, about 3/4 oppose cutting food assistance programs. Did I get that right? Am I on the mark there?
Yeah, you got it exactly right.
So that to me is like, I see that all the time in our polling. Let's tax billionaires, and why are we cutting this stuff that people need? That seemed to come through to me in your polling.
Yeah, I think I was surprised, especially on the increasing taxes for billionaires. So we asked about it in three ways: billionaires, the ultra wealthy, and corporations, and like across the board in the 80s. I'll agree with your rough language for podcast purposes for sure. Like roughly 80% of Latinos are telling us that they're supportive of increasing taxes. And then most surprising to me is that the numbers hold even for self-identified Republicans. I think there's a narrative that it's like a progressive frame, or that only some group of people would be in favor of increased taxes for the rich. But even among Republicans in our sample, self-reported Republicans in our sample, they're telling us that they're overwhelmingly supportive of increasing taxes for billionaires, for big corporations, and for the wealthy. And we found that bipartisan support also in rejecting cuts for Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and food assistance programs like SNAP. We actually saw the greatest agreement for increasing taxes for billionaires, big corporations, and the wealthy among Biden defectors. So even more than Latinos on average, Biden defectors are overwhelmingly supportive. I think it's like in the 90s. I can pull the number up, but Biden defectors are particularly supportive of increasing taxes for the rich.
Yeah, it's in the 90s. I did look at it just before we got on, and I was like, whoa, that's a mover for Biden defectors. So
yeah, and obviously the big beautiful bill just happened. Like the opposite of what Latinos are telling us they want in this poll is exactly what Republicans just passed. And I think communicating to Latino voters directly about those things, negative messaging isn't the only solution here. I know we'll get to proactive stuff in a minute, but like bringing Trump approval down is clearly not sufficient for increasing approval for Democrats, as we've talked about. But I think it's an important part of the journey we'll take folks on over the next year and change in advance of the midterms, so that they can see that Trump is actually doing the opposite of what they're telling us that they want when it comes to addressing the economy and cost of living.
I mean, that is an interesting question. Did you get a sense that they were aware? I don't know if that's something you were trying to get out of this poll or not. That's like a whole different field of inquiry, right? Is like, what news has actually reached you and what do you know about what's going on? But I don't know. Did you have any sense of that, or was that just not the poll for this?
So we didn't ask it in this poll, but our partners at Priorities USA have done some research about awareness of the BBB, and they found that 61% of Latinos say that they've heard nothing about it. So a majority of Latinos have yet to hear anything about the Republican budget. And again, the priorities of the Republican budget include the total opposite of what Latinos are telling us they want to see as part of this research.
I mean, talk about a ding, 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 ding. Okay, Democrat, just go talk about that. Just go do that. I remember last year in focus groups, the same thing was true about the infrastructure bill, the blue BBB, where it was like, there was all this data that we had in a focus group. Or there was data we brought to a focus group about jobs creation, infrastructure build outs, like just all this kind of data. And in the Latino focus groups, one or two of the participants were like, can we take this paper home? It was like the script. They're like, can we take this home so we can talk about it with our family? We had no idea. And it's like, what is wrong with us that it's in like focus groups where people are learning for the first time about details, good or bad, about policy. And it feels like a very clear place for Democrats to run towards, educating more people. and on all kinds of platforms. I do agree with Joe, this idea that like, what is your message for Latino? What is your message for Black businesses? What is your message for, and it's kind of like, guys, if you can just tell the story first, we're all watching the same things. Like, we're all sort of in the same mix of culture. Of course, there's different breakdowns, but if we just tell the story loud and long enough to everyone, then we can think about like how we tell it in across ways. But let's just get it right the first time. Yeah.
Totally agree with you. I think especially on, like we might want to have a different conversation on an issue like immigration or something, for example. But when it comes to the economy, every time we do research with partners, even on like messaging or priorities, Latinos are working in the same economy structure as everyone else. We face the same challenges as everyone else. And we have the same priorities relatively as other folks do. We want to see increased taxes for billionaires. We want to see protections for social programs, more tools and opportunities for us to get ahead. We work often with our friends at the Winning Jobs Narrative to talk about economic messaging recommendations that work for us, but also work for everybody. I think on the economy in particular, there seems like a really like big opening for a winning message that doesn't need to be like overly micro targeted or cut up for individual segments of the electorate, at least not to start, as you're saying, Tori.
Yeah.
One thing we don't have to school anybody on is whether or not they're making ends meet at their own kitchen table, right? And that you mentioned as something that is one of the reasons they rolled that some of these Biden defectors rolled the dice on Trump, right? Did you get a sense from your polling of whether or not people are feeling that current economic pinch or reasons why some people are not settled, some Latinos are not settled yet on, even though they voted for Trump, voting for Republicans in the midterms? Like, is it something, is it partially that they've been underwhelmed by the things that they were hoping would get better, or do we have any sense of that?
So first, like I said, just like the most heartbreaking piece of data we've gotten, that I've seen in a while, that we found at Equis in this research, is just like how much Latinos in this country are actually struggling. A third not being able to make ends meet is pretty devastating information to get back.
That's current. That just wasn't what was happening for them last year. That's actual current stuff.
It's current, yeah. We don't have a direct comparison to where folks were with that specific question back in November of 2024, but just devastating to hear that our own community is struggling financially that much, and then to only find that an additional third are just scraping by with nothing left over at the end of the day. I don't know if I said this already, but only 11%, only 1 in 10 are telling us that they're living comfortably. It's just really hard information to hear. So Latinos are rating the economy as poor overall, and then in their own personal financial situations, they're just like really not doing well. So it makes sense to take a risk. You're hoping for somebody to do anything for you, just to make things like a little bit better, to get a little bit more breathing room. On the Trump and Republicans question, it's hard to say. There's so many factors, like I said, that go into somebody's decision to vote for anybody. And Trump had this persona as being a good businessman. We can see now that I think it's 44% of Latinos in this poll tell us they actually don't think Trump is a good businessman. And then that 1 in 5 that said they used to, but they don't anymore. So in general, a majority are telling us they currently don't think that Trump is a good businessman, but he did have this persona over so long. And, Republicans were trusted on the economy for such a long time. It'll be interesting to see how all of the things, their like lack of delivering on some of their economic promises and what their brand has been traditionally on being able to take on the economy in a particular way, how all of those things kind of work together into voters' decision-making going into next November.
So this is me sort of theorizing a little bit. Just, it feels to me like I have a fair number. I feel like I have in my own family an example of a skipper, a defector, or a flipper, or just like the people who were always MAGA all the time. Like I know all three Latinos.
The many phases of Tory's family.
I do. I know them all. And the Latino side, I'm not even talking about my in-laws. I'm talking about my own side. And I feel like the MAGAs are, it's very difficult. Let's just not even let's just not even worry about them. But like in terms of the flippers and the skippers, the defectors and the skippers, it's like, it feels to me like they know the concept of kayfabe, like literally, like we watch wrestling. I grew up watching wrestling in my household. Like and it's all, we always knew it was fake, like, but it's fun. It's a soap opera. It's fun. It's fun. So have fun with it. So we all kind of like allow ourselves to understand the drama of this thing. And when I would ask folks, like, but what about Trump's rhetoric that is just so damn racist? It doesn't bother you? And they would say, oh, Tory, like, that's just rhetoric. Like, it's just part of the show. It's just what he does to kind of keep some of the MAGA happy so that he can build a coalition. But we put up with it because we know it's just show, it's just rhetoric. And we believe he's a good businessman. So like, they'll put up with the parts that are the most painful because it feel like painful personally, because it doesn't feel real. And as long as the money is there, it's fine. They can put up with the racism. And the fact that like the money's not there and like there's like increased allowance of what's going to be widespread racial profiling through a 20 times ICE budget. I mean, we're already seeing like reports out of Nevada that ICE enforcement is keeping people away from their jobs in Vegas. Like, it feels like this is where the kayfabe breaks. This is where the drama could break. And I think it's like we as like Democratic strategists have gotten real twisted into pretzels about the role of race in and like identity politics in modern electioneering. And we had Cornell Belcher on this call or in this podcast many weeks ago now, a couple months ago, when he said, I said something like, tell me about the state of identity. And like, everything Trump does is identity politics. We just don't know how to use it in the same way that he does. Like we, the royal we on the D side. But it feels like this is another one of those openings where it's like, if some segment of Latinos is like, he's not a good oh my gosh, he's not a good businessman. That's a really big deal that we should be exploiting massively by saying, see, his rhetoric, like the racist part of his rhetoric was all he had, guys. Like there's nothing else there. And just continue to undermine that confidence. Anyway, I think it's an opening. I think it's a big opening.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about it. I think, so we did the same kind of like deep dive on an issue earlier this year, as I think you guys know. So we did an immigration specific poll, and 65% of Latinos there told us that they're worried that Trump's mass deportations and like actions on immigration broadly would increase racial profiling. Like I think folks are feeling the squeeze on the move from just rhetoric to actual action. So that's one thing on the one hand. I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say?
Well, I was saying, I think it's an opening to exploit, like, he's not a good businessman. And you were saying, I was trying to, I think what I'm doing is linking the immigration enforcement with the economic argument. And you were saying that. Yeah.
Thank you for refreshing my memory. What I was going to say is, I think we've talked a lot about those kinds of folks, the folks that you're talking about in your family, like people who might have said, people we know, like anecdotally, who might have said like, oh, it's just rhetoric. I'm really concerned about pocketbook issues or the economy. But I also just wanted to offer, we're going to share our 2024 postmortem shortly in the next couple of months. But we've also been finding that this perception that Democrats are better for Hispanics, the inverse of what you're talking about, actual care for the community and being better for people like me, has been a reason that even some conservative Latinos have decided to stay with Democrats. This perception that the party cares more about their community or will fight more for people like them. So I think on the one hand, there are certainly stories of folks who might like overlook that kind of language in favor of pocketbook issues or financial concerns. But on the flip side, we're also seeing that concern for the community or care for the community from a party has in some cases overridden other concerns around other issues that folks might have had with the Democratic Party. So the way that race is showing up for people, how important it is in their voting calculus is interesting to think about from like the Trump angle, but also from the Democratic side.
Yeah. I'm excited to see your big postmortem. I guess I didn't realize that was still forthcoming because you've had so much data from 24.
Breaking news right here. You heard it first glimpse, first sneak peek at the Equis, what happened in 2024. I love that. I don't want to leave this topic just for a second, this immigration topic, without noting, because I thought this was so notable. After, I was talking about these percentages, people who, Latinos who support raising taxes on billionaires, roughly 80%, oppose cutting Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, roughly 80%. And then the only expense that most Latinos support cutting is immigration enforcement. It's the only expense that most Latinos support cutting. I just thought that was really interesting in terms of we don't want to cut this other stuff, but we could take a break on that immigration enforcement a little bit. So
100%. And again, as part of the big, beautiful bill, there was an increase in investment in immigration enforcement. So across the board, everything the big, beautiful bill does that we tracked in this survey, Latinos are supportive of the opposite.
Right. Let's because the other part you had a really interesting response to Tory, and the other part you were talking about is this sort of which came through in your polling, this idea of Latino voters sort of feeling aligned in some ways with the fact that Democrats are looking out for them. There was these are some bright spots for Democrats that, again, we can't take for granted, but it's something to work with for sure. 63% of Latino voters view Republicans as prioritizing the wealthy, and which your report characterized as, and this is reinforcing what you just said, a core to the narrative that has kept Hispanics voting for Democrats despite recent shifts. So that was basically the point you just said, but I'm just giving it another nudge there, which I thought was really interesting. And this I found somewhat surprising. And I don't know, maybe I've just been beaten down as a progressive or a Democrat, but Democrats hold a double-digit advantage over Republicans on who's more trusted to handle cost of living. That was plus 19. And who's more trusted to handle the economy, plus 12. And I was interested, we kind of touched on this earlier, but I was interested in whether you felt Democrat, it's, I guess, cost of living, but the economy is always Republicans are better for the economy. I think in the general population surveys, it feels like it's always, Republicans, right? But here, Democrats are winning on cost of living and the economy by double digits. And I wondered if you think it's just is that just we're not the party in power now? Or is that something bigger than just the gravitational forces of the midterm cycle for a party that's in power? Is it something beyond that?
I think it is bigger. I think Republicans have always had some strength on the economy, and it was one of Trump's greatest strengths in his first term. His economic approval also is usually higher. At least in his first term, his economic approval was higher than his overall job approval. And for our last couple of polls, we're not finding that. It's about the same, if not worse. So it does feel notable that in this case, we're starting to see a double-digit Democratic advantage. We mentioned it in the memo too, I think, but the comparison point, just for context. So now on cost of living, the Democratic advantage is plus 19 among Latino voters. That's part of this national survey that we did. In 2022, in battleground states, so slightly different geography, Republicans had a plus 5 advantage on cost of living. So we went from Republicans plus 5 to Democrats plus 19 from the end of 2022 to now. So it's a pretty significant shift.
Okay. That feels good. Does anybody else feel good about that? Joe, you want to?
Great. Keep it up.
All right. Here's a question. Are Latinos the new swing voters? Is that the wrong frame?
It's a good question. I don't know about new. I think that over the past few election cycles, the dynamism of the Latino electorate in particular has become even more obvious, maybe to folks who weren't paying attention. But Latinos are incredibly swingy. And every month it feels like we get further into the Trump administration, feels like more proof that Latinos are a section of the total electorate worth fighting over and fighting for. I think it was an easy narrative on election night and in the weeks following it to talk about big Latino swings to the right. And we should talk about those things. Latinos have shifted, but I do think looking at some of this data around frustration, around lack of delivery, around cost of living, frustration or cynicism towards both parties, Latinos are just telling us they have big concerns that they want their government to have answers for. They want somebody to acknowledge the challenges that they're facing, the things in their lives that aren't working, and to give them tools and opportunities to find solutions to those challenges. It's unacceptable that a third of Latinos in this country are telling us they can't make ends meet. And so they're really just looking for somebody to deliver on the promises that they say that they've made. There's a huge frustration from Latinos in our focus groups that Democrats are all talk and no action. Even when they agree with Democrats' approach to solutions to problems, if they don't believe, if there's no credibility among Democrats that they'll actually deliver solutions, what Latinos want to see is actual action taken to take on some of these, like I said, challenges, frustrations, priorities.
Joe, that feels very, very in line with a lot of the research we've done.
Oh, 100%. I was going to bring up on our skippers piece, looking, we don't have a lot of Latino specific in there because it was a national sample, but one of the notable things, talking about like cynicism to both parties, is that of those Latino folks that sat out this last election, having just voted for Biden, they're negative 42 favorability for MAGA Republicans, but they are only +3 for Democrats in Congress. So still, like, to your point, like, they're just looking for somebody that they like want to support Democrats. Can you, like, guys, show me that I can be there? And I think the fact that it cuts, like, from both people that sat out, both people that gave Trump a try, like, again, the sort of unity in the story we need to be telling to rebuild this coalition, I think is really important. But yeah, the opportunities here and the need, the imperative for Democrats to show up, I cannot be more clear, I think, in any of this polling.
It's interesting. It seems like if I were advising the abundance wing of the Democratic Party, I would say you should have a Latino outreach strategy, because Latinos want to fix things fast too, guys. Let's
100%.
Yeah.
Kerry, can I ask a question? I don't want to derail. I don't know if I put it in the script here, but one thing I did want to ask about in terms of like the Latinos' views, especially on Republicans, there were two things that kind of caught me in the poll, and that was both the like worldview that government spending is out of control, but at the same time don't cut stuff, and the like belief in waste, fraud, and abuse, which are two like big Republican frames that seem to be they have bought into. And I wonder if you can speak to that and what we need to do to pull them out of there. How does that square with some of the other, pieces of the poll? Again, there feels like there's some contradictory too, but it concerns me a little bit too that these are big Republican frames that seem to have seeped into and been sort of, consensus among this group.
Yeah, so in this research, we found that 68% of Latinos are telling us that they think government spending is out of control. It's pretty significant. We also asked about, like you said, concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse, given all the conversation about DOGE and the Department of Government Efficiency this year. And 93%, almost all Latinos are telling us they're at least somewhat concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse. And so naturally, we asked about specific places to cut then. Like, if we're concerned about it, what would you get rid of? Give us some guidance for like where to start our focus. And so we offered the increasing taxes for billionaires and the wealthy as a way to offset spending. And we also offered examples of places to cut government spending. And like we've discussed, there was broad support for increasing taxes and not a lot of support for cutting programs, except for a slight majority for cutting immigration enforcement spending. So the way we're reading this data is it seems like the narrative around waste, fraud, and abuse has clearly permeated among the electorate. But it feels like Latinos have concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse in individual lanes of spending, not that whole swaths of spending, like whole lanes of spending are considered waste, fraud, and abuse. So it's not that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are waste, fraud, and abuse, but they probably agree that under spending for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, some level of waste, fraud, and abuse is happening. I think that framing is really important because I feel like DOGE was taking advantage of whatever perceptions they were also seeing clearly around concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse, and using it as excuses to pull full departments, to cut full lanes of spending. And I don't think we're seeing support for that. We're certainly not seeing support for that among Latinos in this research. So the question of what to do next or where to go from here feels a little unclear to me, but certainly it's not cutting full lanes of spending, at least in the categories we asked about here. There seems like the perception has really broken through, but it seems like their belief is that it's happening underneath buckets of investment that they actually agree are worth investing in.
Mm-hmm. I would even argue too that like reinforcing that frame is dangerous as well, right? Because it's very clear these big expensive things they support deeply, and so focusing on the services and the aspects that these voters support, rather than sort of again like reinforcing these Republican frames, which I feel like we get sucked into a lot, will be important on sort of winning that argument with these folks.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and sort of contradict Joe, because I like to do that.
Drama, Kate.
I'm not really. I'm making a little bit of a joke here, but I do want to say, I think Latinos are onto something about cutting immigration enforcement. Because if there's going to be one place that there's going to be a heck of a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse over the next 3 years, it is $180 billion some dollars being dumped into an area that is nothing more than a performative act of racism and racial profiling. So
I guess my point would be you don't need to frame it as waste, fraud, and abuse. You need to frame it as we have talked about, the most powerful like discussion of what that immigration enforcement does to people and their families and kids and the safety of all Americans and constitutional rights and all that. Like, we don't need to be talking about waste, fraud, and abuse. That's fair. Destruction of the Constitution.
I think Latinos are onto it. They're onto it. They're like, if we're going to cut something, cut here. I think it's good.
I agree with that.
Anyway, sorry, I cut you off, or maybe Joe cut you off, Tori.
I don't even know where I'm going anymore. Just no, I mean, I guess I'm processing Joe's point, because I think it's a really nuanced one, where it's just like, it feels like in this particular polling with Latinos, there's like this dichotomy where it's like, on the one hand, they love the kind of services that just got cut by BBB. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, those services cost things, and they're saying things that are costly should be looked at, scrutinized. And I agree with, the reason I think that we put ourselves in that dichotomy is because we put ourselves in the role that we're often repeating the Republican talking points, which is what Joe is saying about waste, fraud, and abuse. And what that does is it kind of puts a microscope on government and critique of government. And I think we should be, and I do think, I hate that I'm constantly the abundance girl on this call, but I do think the abundance folks have attempted to figure out how to talk. They're attempting to figure out how to talk about putting a microscope on government without it being with using the same words as the Republicans use. I think they're helping those words, unfortunately, because I don't know, back to like the anecdotes, but everyone I know who's a defector or a skipper or a really grumpy Harris voter, there were a lot of Democrats that went ahead and did it, but they were real grumpy about it. Will say things like, I don't know. Is government really working? I've even heard Terrence Woodbury talk about this. Forget just my own anecdotes. Like, Terrence has whole data sets around like, government's not working for people, folks. Like, have you talked to anyone in your family? Do they enjoy their experience at the DMV? Do they enjoy like the process to get the FAFSA cleared so that you can qualify for college? Like, does anybody really enjoy their interactions with government? And so there's something about then being the pro-government party that puts us into a challenging position. But we've got to figure out a way to talk about it better, because without it, we're screwed. This is what we're, finding in this new moment, is it's like, when it doesn't work, children die literally when there's the first crisis. So this is where I think we need to explore language a little bit more as advocates and strategists moving into the next cycle.
I would offer, certainly there's a comms and messaging component to this, but it's not about how to talk about it. We just need to show people that government works for them. by making it work for them. You know what I mean? Like all of this frustration is that, you know, Democrats are all talk and no action. That's the energy we get from our groups and from our voters. You know, we can figure out how to talk about this stuff all we want, but if voters don't feel an impact from the changes that our leaders are actually making, people who have the power to do something about it, then they're just going to stop believing us. If we keep saying Democrats are delivering for you and it doesn't feel like it, we're just eroding trust for the party, but also for the individual groups doing that kind of communication. So certainly a messaging question, but I think it's at this point, it just feels like action is required. Democrats actually have to take on some of these challenges and deliver solutions to people.
Which is why we're seeing stock moving from Trump to undecided, not Trump back into Democrats' lane.
Right.
It also shows why it's going to be so important in the 2026 cycle to not just mobilize resources to win the House. That needs to happen. We absolutely need a pushback on the policies at the federal level. We absolutely need to have that House in place to certify elections by 28. But it's going to be the governors and it's going to be the people with the power of the purse to make policy in state, whether it's like city council or governor, that's going to actually be able to lead the way. Because even if we get back a majority in the House in 26, it's not a governing majority. We're not going to land a governing majority with the Senate. And so like, it's going to be a lot harder to show proactively what we can do from the federal level.
Let me, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Caitlin.
I was just gonna say, I do think that's what makes it tough. Like, I feel how difficult the results of these polls might be for elected officials or like other folks in power. It's like, well, I can't do anything about it now. How am I supposed to build credibility back? All I have is talk. Like, I don't have any way. The only thing I can do is Trump accountability or negative messaging on Trump. Like, what are our actual tools for building credibility back with voters and showing them we can deliver on the promises that we're making? So I do think it's a difficult spot to be in. But what you're offering, Tory, I think is an example of how we can like take the little wins we can get over time. This is a long game. It's a short game and a long game. Like, wherever we can deliver wins for folks so that we can have tangible impacts on people's lives in the short term, and then do our best to build power so that we can start to have governing majorities and we can start to actually make big changes to deliver for folks. I think Democrats just have to find opportunities where they can, even given the limited ability to deliver on things maybe in the short term.
I do think along like the one place where I think like some of the rhetoric, like the talk only might break through is in the like taxing the billionaire class. Also seems to be a very like the drawing the line between like, if you elect more Democrats, these are the people that we're going to get to like to pay for all these things that we want, like really drawing out that enemy and that like that split between everything is expensive for you and it's these guys' fault, I think is important.
Well, because I think the first step, so I think actually in the short term, if we don't have a collective vision, like if there's no proactive vision for how we would take on some of these challenges, if we had power, I don't think there's any like starting ground for folks to try to take a chance on Democrats again. If they're going to be in a place where they're frustrated with Trump and Republicans, they need to know what Democrats are offering to do differently to take a risk and flip back. If we're talking about Biden defectors, for example, or just to like take a chance on even your skippers. Like, why am I excitedly voting for a Democrat? What would they do? What are they saying at least they would do if they had an opportunity to do anything? And then when we have power back, if we can convince enough people that the vision that we're offering is something that they want to sign up for, and Democrats are able to get power back, prioritizing on delivering on those campaign promises feels like the most urgent priority. Because if we continue to feed into the narrative, if Democrats continue to feed into the narrative of campaign promises without no actual delivery, I think it's just going to hurt chances among Latinos and probably the broader electorate over the long term.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good place for us to leave it right there. I know that Caitlin has a hard stop at the top of the hour. I think, you know, if I were to reflect on this, I would say both in terms of these Latino voters and the skippers, we are seeing groups of people who are moving off of Republicans or were already off of Republicans, but aren't moving on to Democrats, right? That there has to be, to Caitlin's point, a proactive vision. Otherwise, there's no reason to get them from point A to point B, right? So those are things to grow on. I also want to highlight the 61% of Latinos who had heard nothing about the Republican bill, which has a ton of stuff in it that Latino voters do not like at all. So do you want to have one last thought, Caitlin, before we close out, or?
No, I think we covered it. I think the proactive vision for our leaders feels like the number one priority in the short term. And, maybe I'll just add for folks that are like organizing on the outside, for organizations that are communicating directly to voters about Trump's overreach on immigration or his lack of delivery on the economy, it's really important to stay focused on the economic messaging frames that are most effective for us. So talking about the big, beautiful bill feels like a number one priority, as much as we might get distracted by Epstein news or military deployment in DC. Staying focused on communicating the most important pieces of our economic frames feels like a big priority.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Caitlin Jury of Equis, and Tory and Joe, for a super interesting discussion. A little bit of hope there, a lot of work to be done. Caitlin, where can people find this research?
You can go to our website at weareequis.us.
Okay, perfect. Check it out. They've got more there. They have a ton of polls on there, by the way, but this is the latest and greatest, if you will. So thank you to our listeners. Remember, recruit and review. Our listenership grows steadily every month. Let's keep the trend going. And with that, we will see you next Thursday. Until then, do good, be well, hug your loved ones, and please tell your dog I say hi.